last topic we're going to talk about in terms of drawback types is manufacturing drawback. And manufacturing drawback applies when you import raw materials or component parts of a larger good and incorporate them into a finished product that is eventually exported. You can claim drawback on those raw material or component parts, as the case may be, when that finished good is exported. The trick here is that the new product that you've incorporated those components and parts into needs to have a new name, character, or use. For anybody that's familiar with the substantial transformation standard, it's similar. The components and the raw materials have to be changed. It has to be a complete production. You also cannot include any of raw materials or component parts that were wasted in the manufacturing process. So if I bring in fabric to produce garments and I want to export those finished dresses or jackets or shirts or whatever the case may be, any fabric that I've lost in that manufacturing process, the value of it cannot be included on my drawback entry. It's only on what actually leaves. And in that case, you'll generally need a bill of materials for the finished good that you're exporting. So it's a little more complicated. But that is the long and short of manufacturing drawback. Again, it's also broken down, like unused merchandise drawback, into direct identification and substitution. So if you bring in raw materials, you use those raw materials and export them in a finished product, simple enough. It gets tricky when you bring in raw materials, substitute the raw materials into a finished product, and then export that. It's the same 8-digit HTS standard, but that's the basics, the ABCs of manufacturing.
One of the things that I want to talk about is just the idea of, let's kind of lay out a simple example. Let's take my pen here, right? Mm-hmm. And if I import the ink part of my pen, right, into the U.S., I assemble it here in the U.S. with U.S. made product, and then I export this entire pen back out. Is that manufacturing drawback?
So I think it's going to depend on the classification of the ink and the pen. If it changes, I'm sorry, can you just you imported the ink, right?
Yep, I just imported the ink, and the rest of the body of the pen was made here in the U.S.
Okay, so the ink has to be incorporated into a new product with a name, character, and use. If I was going to make the argument that you were eligible for manufacturing drawback, you would say that the ink is different from the pen, and it was incorporated into the pen, and it can't be taken out, and it can't be used separately, and exported it, so it's a new product in use, that you would be eligible for manufacturing drawback. That would be the argument. I don't know if it would carry the day. It used to be under the old law that you needed to get a ruling or locate a ruling on your particular case before you could claim manufacturing drawback. That has changed somewhat under the new law because it's subject to the new liberal rules. You'd have to research the classification of the ink versus the pen, but that would be the argument.
So you brought up the old rules, and when we talk about old versus new, most of you have probably heard maybe the phrase TIFTIA, TFTEA. That's usually when we start talking about new rules. That's what we're referring to is the new TIFTIA language for drawback in general. But let's talk about those rulings for a second. Prior to TIFTIA, there was basically kind of like you said, two processes to do this, right? There were some general base rulings for drawback that were already out there. And then option one, option two, you basically write in an application to customs, kind of explain your process and why this is a ruling is needed. So what I'm hearing you say is that you no longer have to do that.
That's right.
So in those scenarios, when we get to that manufacturing drawback, instead of, because with especially the new Section 301s, we're seeing a lot of requests now for people to say, hey, I want to do drawback. There's benefit that exists at that 10% level that didn't used to exist. So, what are their next steps? Is it still kind of lining out what does that manufacturing process look like, and maybe mentally kind of thinking through, if I was requesting a ruling, this is what it looks like? Or would you recommend they kind of go a different route?
No, that's exactly the route I would go. I would certainly line it out before I started to do it to make sure it could qualify, because you want to be able to substantiate anything you submit to the government, because it's always subject to being challenged. And if you're wrong, you'll have to pay the duties. And there's always a chance, although if you acted in good faith, you should be okay, but there's always a chance that they can issue a penalty if you owe the duty. So you would want to make sure your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted before you went ahead and claim that drawback.